In this week's episode, I speak to Sonikka, who's a journalist with experience working at CNN's Washington bureau, Indian newspaper The Hindu, and soon joining Bloomberg in Hong Kong. We speak about her background as a fellow third culture kid, her passion for storytelling, and the power of data-driven journalism in an age of misinformation. Hi, Sonikka. Welcome to the Leadership Unplugged podcast. It's fantastic to have you here today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Mo.
So why don't we get straight into it? And with all of our guests, we like to start off with a little bit about themselves, their early lives, their origin story, if you will. So I'll hand it over to you.
My origin story sounds very dramatic. But okay, I am a journalist. I am currently working for a primarily print organization in India, and I have been working for about 3 years on and off, thanks to COVID. But I came from a broadcast background. I have been doing journalism related things since middle school, since I was in sixth grade. So it's kind of just always been something in the background at that time because I wanted to be a doctor back when I was, a child.
Really? I didn't know
Yeah.
this.
Before I took chemistry, I thought I could be a doctor. And then I took chemistry and I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely not for me.
Yeah.
And then, it's always just kind of been there, but I've always been very multimedia focused. I have previously worked in broadcast news, and
Mhm.
I did my undergrad in the States. I was in DC, working in DC, and now I'm in India, and it's a very different setup, but I love what I do, and I'm so grateful that I'm able to have this job and do it at a time when it's so important for there to be, people actually giving facts rather than misinformation, disinformation, whatever it is, whatever they want to call it.
Okay, that's interesting. So from a very young age, you had that kind of interest in journalism. Do you know where that came from? What kind of sparked that?
It's completely a coincidence. I so when I was in elementary school, I was
Oh,
in the I know, I was in the US. My family was living there at that time, and it was every time you move from elementary to middle to high school, it's just that last year is do whatever you can to get into a good middle school, to get into a good high school. And this one particular middle school had what they called a magnet program. So they had these special kind of extracurricular type classes, but it was part of that curriculum. So you had science, math, English, whatever, but then you also had you could do dance or orchestra or theater. And one of the options was broadcast arts. And
mhm.
for all of the other programs, you needed to have some kind of portfolio. Like if you had to dance, you had to try out. If you wanted to be an orchestra, you had to play an instrument. Broadcast was the only one that didn't require anything. I just
Right.
had to go in for an interview and read out. I remember I read out a script. Just I don't even know why, what that told them about me.
Mhm.
But the whole goal of it was just for me to get into this good school, and I got in, and I did 3 years I was over there, and I realized that I didn't realize then. I realized in retrospect, but I just loved it. It was so much fun, producing these videos, and in eighth grade we did daily newscasts that were live, and the whole school would watch it, and it's just very cool that I got to do that at such a young age.
That is really cool, and that's really interesting. I guess was it the element of being able to create something as well that attracted you, as well as I guess current affairs and knowing what's going around.
Yeah, it was definitely I've always been a creative person, and this was my mom is an artist, and I have a lot of art around my house, but I suck at drawing and painting and all of that. And I've always loved to read, and I've always loved to write. I've been reading and creatively writing literally for as long as I can remember. I think, the fantasy was I'll grow up and be an author. right? Like I was like, I love Harry Potter, I'll be like JK Rowling, which I absolutely do not want to be like her now. But, that was the fantasy that I had. And of course, as you like grow up, you kind of realize that to be an author full time creatively is like no money.
Mm.
And I think this was a way for me subconsciously at that age, even though I wasn't thinking about it, was just like, oh, this is a way that I can be creative, but also like learn so much about the world. Being a third culture kid, having grown up in different places my whole life, I was like, this is such a cool way for me to just learn about what's going on around the world and how different and also similar people are. And I also think what was really cool in a way was the fact that we were 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds who are like writing little scripts about like the Arab Spring, right? And sure, I was probably like copy pasting most of my script from from whatever news article I'd read.
Yeah.
But I think it was cool that we were tackling these kinds of serious issues at such a young age and being taken seriously by my teachers at that time. And like, you know, we had to tell, our school about whatever was happening in these newscasts. So I think I really liked that kind of, I don't want to say power, but like privilege that we had, that we were able to do this while also doing like fun, silly little like videos like, do you like Coke or Pepsi more? I remember that was like a filler video that we would always do just to like put into the newscast.
Right. I guess it goes to show the impact that those early years can have in terms of getting exposure to different things, which could spark your interest. And I quite resonated with, I guess we have similar backgrounds being
Mhm.
third culture kids to an extent. And I was actually having to think about my my kind of deep rooted interest that I had in subjects like history, geography, social sciences, and I don't know if this is being a little bit too introspective or deep, but I feel like to an extent that was part of the appeal was I think studying social sciences and being able to almost position yourself or orient yourself to an extent in kind of in history and understanding how societies have kind of come to be even on a spatial level. I guess with my interest in geography, it was always a feeling of okay, like where do we come from, how
Yeah.
do we all fit together and how do I fit together in that kind of piece. So that's quite an interesting thread.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what the main thing with third culture kids is like, we have no idea where we belong. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like figuring out what all these other people's lives look like and seeing how we fit in or how we connect. I don't know. It's just like looking for a connection, I guess, at the end of the day.
And how did you feel, I guess? Well, maybe if we start with your experience working in the States in journalism in DC of all places, and then that transition to working in journalism in India
Mhm.
as a third culture kid who's come home to an extent. So maybe if there is a place called home, it'd be interesting to understand kind of what that process was like and what you learned and what you found challenging.
Yeah. Okay. So I did my undergrad in DC. And of course, I mean, because I had spent some of my childhood in the US, I did kind of know a little bit about like politics. I definitely know more about US politics than I do Indian. So, you know, do what you will with that. But I had a little bit of background, but it was never something I'd followed closely while I was in high school. It wasn't particularly a topic that interested me a lot. But because I was in DC, most of the students at my university were studying government or international relations or something to that effect. And also because it was an extremely liberal campus community, everyone was very, very active about like social justice issues. And there was always, some kind of rally or whatever the case might be. Ignoring politics was never an option. So I found myself deeply, deeply entrenched in what's happening in the US politically. Of course, also I started college, in January of 2016. I took a gap semester and then started in Jan. So Trump was inaugurated shortly after I started. So of course there was so much going on that that just happened to be what my focus was. That's what people were talking about. So that definitely like transitioned once I into the workplace. So once I started working, I was primarily, focusing on political news. Also, I do think that the US media, at least broadcast news, is very, very focused on just politics. And I do think, again, that just comes with like
Hmm.
the Trump presidency. Everything was sort of tied back to that political, play that was happening in DC, unlike, the BBC or something where you do have a little more of like a international focus, or there's just more diverse stories being told. And I mean diverse in the type of stories, not the people that the stories are about. So yeah, I was, working very closely with producers and the anchors and the assignment desk and all of these different players. And I think what I realized over the course of I was there for a year. Over the course of that year, I think I really realized that I do not want to cover politics long term.
Okay.
Um, and I kind of also had a bit of a skewed understanding, I think, of what it means to be a journalist. I felt like I had to have like a base knowledge or like have a base knowledge of politics or couldn't like separate political news from like anything else that was happening, which I do think is still true to an extent, but I felt kind of like trapped. Like I have to know this for me to be a journalist. And when I moved back to India, I was really nervous because, at least in the US, it's like Republicans and Democrats, and that's it for the most part, right? Over here, you've got hundreds of parties. Each party has like an extremely rich, insane history. There's so many different politicians. And I was like, I have no idea how I am going to learn everything that I need to know to even like be able to write like a simple story about something, right? And what I've learned at my job here is that first of all, there's so many different things happening that you don't have to self to a certain beat or feel like you have to just focus on one thing to be a good journalist.
Hmm.
And I also have a lot more freedom here to explore different topics. I mean, I'm a multimedia journalist that works with the data team. And with data, there's just so many different topics that you can cover, from climate change to health to the number of people getting arrested under like certain draconian laws, or like taxes. Like there's so many different things
Hmm.
that I think learning and like being exposed to all of these different topics has just made me a better journalist, and also made me realize that there's a lot more to this field that doesn't have to be rooted in politics. You can like have a little bit of politics in your story, but it doesn't have to be the base.
Right.
I don't
That's
know if that answered your question at all.
definitely, and that is quite interesting because I guess to even instinctively, when I think of journalism, I think of coverage of political
Mhm.
events, and I think of journalism's role in a kind of democratic system in holding institutions accountable, expressing the will of the people, if you may, to in a utopian kind of system. So it is easy to forget that there's a lot more to be talked about than purely politics, unless you subscribe to the view that everything at the end of the day comes down to politics. I just wanted to touch on something else you mentioned, which was this. I guess this kind of struggle or view that you need to know enough or be an expert on something to be able to talk about it. And I think in this day and age that I personally have felt that, and that it can be quite I think, a limiting factor to an extent, especially in such a rapidly changing world, which is so complex. There is so much kind of depth of knowledge on certain topics, which other people may have. But how do you grapple with that as someone who needs to commentate on a lot of different things all the time and not necessarily being a complete expert in all of those fields?
Yeah.
How do you have a sense of confidence and authority when you're producing content?
Yeah. This is something I definitely struggle with, and I'm so grateful for my team in my current workplace because they're so supportive, and also they kind of like almost like humble me when I'm stressing out. They'll be like, "You need to relax. Like, first of all, the person you're interviewing does not care about you that much. They're not going to think that much about what you say and don't say." And also, they're like, "It's okay. Like, you don't need to know everything." And in fact, I think kind of realizing that actually I'm not an expert. My role is kind of to not know things and then figure it out as I speak to people, as I do research. I definitely really, really do a lot of research. I recently worked on a podcast episode about custodial violence,
Mhm.
which is a huge issue in India. And I was interviewing this really, really well known, really respected, retired high court justice. And I was so nervous. And I didn't, the amount of research I did, I was honestly like, I think I'm like going to be a lawyer by the end of this. Like, I was like reading all of the laws, I was reading so many different judgments just so that I could have like a good as good of an understanding as possible of what this issue is like and what it entails and what the nuances of it are. So of course doing research definitely helps, but also just acknowledging that like it's okay, like it's actually impossible for me to know everything about every single subject. And once I acknowledge that, I think it helps me be more confident in the interview because I'll be like, correct me if I'm wrong, am I understanding this correctly? Because at the end of the day, the reader, the viewer, they probably don't know either, right? Like the whole point of it is to get information and get it in a way that's simple enough for everyone to understand. So if you go in with that perspective, I think that really helps. And of course, you can always fact check later, if something seems a little off. So
Right. Okay. That's interesting. And do you feel that primarily do you work with in terms of content you produce? Are you typically interviewing others and interviewing um, experts in their field or people from different kind of walks of life, and it's more about facilitating the conversation than being an expert yourself?
so I generally speak to experts, and because I work with the data team, I generally have a set of numbers that come from the findings of like, whatever the rest of my team finds. And it's kind of either breaking that down, understanding it, putting it in a context, because when these stories go in print, there's only so much space. And
Mhm.
sometimes people just don't understand what that means for them. And we don't have the space to explain it. So when we bring these experts in, I kind of try to unpack that and make it more like impact based.
Mhm. Mhm.
For example, we did, a story about diabetes and whether it's, a rich man's disease, as it's generally, called, because we saw that there were a lot of people in rural India from poorer backgrounds who were also getting the disease. And by speaking to these two experts, we kind of realized that no, with like the introduction of all of these like fast foods and packaged foods that are cheap and accessible, it's kind of leveling out in a way. So I'm super simplifying that, but that's something, that kind of conversation is something we can't have in print. So by bringing in these experts, that's, what we're trying to achieve.
Right. Okay. Okay. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work you do with data, how this kind of data team or this kind of concept came about, and what it's trying to achieve?
So the data team existed before me. But I think so. What we do is look through, whatever kinds of stories are going on right now, whether that's oil prices are increasing or um, if there's something in the news, like if a journalist or an activist has been arrested under the UAPA sedition law, which is, this draconian law that the current government has been using a lot. um, we'll take that and then that'll be like the base of our story. And from there, we see, okay, what data can we find to understand this phenomenon? So if it's, a journalist has been arrested, we'll take a look at how many people will go to, and generally we do use government data because that's what's available to us. But we'll go to the National Crime Records Bureau statistics and see how many people have been arrested under this law over the past so many ever years and see if there's a trend and kind of piece it together that way. And it's honestly really nice working with data because numbers don't lie. My first story was about how open defecation is still very much a thing, even though the current government's, under the Swachh Bharat campaign, said that India is open defecation free. It's simply not true when you look at the data. And this is data that is being provided by the government. So, you know, you can say whatever you want to say, but at the end of the day, your department, your health department is putting out this data that is telling a very different story and you can't dispute that. So yeah, it's cool to be able to work with a tool that is as, in plain sight as can be.
That's interesting, and I guess, but part of that is the transparency you can probably show with the sources of your data
Mm-hmm.
as well to establish that veracity. Because I guess some could argue that whilst numbers themselves don't lie, the way you tell the story with those numbers can definitely be misrepresented. Um, so do you think it's I guess a powerful tool in within journalism, but one that definitely still requires a degree of judgment and a degree of integrity in terms of the journalistic standards that need to apply.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that you have to be very careful with the way that you interpret data. And that goes from understanding the methodology of how it was collected, um, kind of figuring out if something seems off, you should go and see why it seems off. Looking at the source, looking at the time period during which this data was collected, um, the sample number, there's so many different things. Like, for example, a big issue, I guess, is that when you look at just the bare data, a lot of the times Tamil Nadu and Kerala come out as the states in India that are sicker, as in, so when you just see that these are the states that have more people getting sick, that sounds bad, right? But in reality, the data is showing that because Tamil Nadu and Kerala have more better healthcare systems, have
Mhm.
stronger healthcare systems. So people are able to go to the doctor and get checked up if they're not feeling well, which is not the case in other states. So if people aren't able to go to the doctor, how are you going to record anything, right? So that kind of understanding of what, whether the data is representing something that is the data is representing something that's true, but why is it true is something that you kind of have to figure out.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of talk these days about, I think, both in the political sphere and just generally within society, that we seem to be living in a sort of post-truth world where there's multiple realities. Politicians around the globe are caught lying kind of very consistently and yet facing no repercussions. Especially, I think, as a student of history and someone who's worked in the political and social kind of field for throughout their career, do you think this is a trend? Or do you think it's always been this way? Um, what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's definitely, a trend now. I think it's undeniable. I think world leaders now will lie whenever they have a chance. And I don't think this is something that's, I think like there are some obvious world leaders that come to mind when you think of this stuff. But then I also think that because there are these obvious cases, a lot of the other ones that you would maybe expect better from kind of get away with it sometimes. That being said, I know that I mean, I'm not sure if this existed before Trump, but I know when I was working in the US, there was a whole fact checking team and they were constantly on it. And they were on it not just for Trump, they were fact checking every other candidate during the elections. They were, yeah, like pretty much all the time they were fact checking everyone. So that's good, I guess. I mean, ideally, world leaders should not be lying to us, but I think that it's probably something that's always existed. It just took having someone as out there as, I'll keep using Trump as an example because I did work in journalism while he was president. But taking someone as who was lying as obviously as he was kind of like what pushed us to realize that fact checking as a separate department was needed. But I do think that, it's nothing particularly new. It's just the extent of it. And also, of course, the internet has made it, easier for these kinds of lies, disinformation to spread.
Right. Yeah. It does feel like society's become somewhat desensitized. And you see that with the level of political repercussions leaders get for lying. Yes,
Mhm.
I feel like 10, 15 years ago, when an MP was caught out in a brazen lie, they would resign.
Yeah.
Um, and now it just, the next news cycle kind of washes over, and we move on.
Yeah.
Um, do you think the role of, um, to use a right wing term, the liberal news media, or news media kind of general, as kind of institutions, their legitimacy has been undermined somewhat in recent years, and or I guess a lack of trust in institutions more generally, especially in Western societies. Um, do you think that's true, and do you think there is potentially a greater role for them to play in the future, or are there alternatives like grassroots types of media or information which could replace and supplant these institutions?
I don't think um, that introducing, like grassroots media or something, citizen journalism, all that stuff, I think those are short term fixes. If you have a problem with something, like you're going to find that problem, no matter where you look. I think the bigger issue that needs to be tackled is that of media literacy. So if you are tuning in to, a news channel that like Fox News, it's right wing, right? You cannot tune into that channel and expect more leftist ideas to be shared there. But that comes with media literacy. You can't tune into CNN and expect right wing. Well, I mean, they have been trying to push for a more center viewpoint. I'm not sure how that's going for them. But you can't tune into CNN and expect the kind of reporting or coverage that Fox News provides. But because people don't have that understanding of, the fact that there are different organizations that do have their own, set of standards or editorial values or whatever the case is, there's that understanding needs to come from the person. I don't think that news organizations, there's no such thing as absolutely 100% unbiased news unless you are like a wire service, unless you're Reuters, the AP, where you're just printing exactly what happened. If you want some level of analysis, if you want some level of discussion, you have to understand that that does come with not a bias, but there's some kind of background there. And if it's not the kind of background that you align with, that's on you. You can't get mad at, the New York Times for publishing an editorial that you don't agree with, but is in line with the New York Times' standards and what they value and their ethics and their code, right? So I think a push for more media literacy is what matters. I don't sure, grassroots movements will come eventually, those organizations will grow, and eventually they'll also, fit in somewhere on this political spectrum. And citizen journalism is, I don't know if that's something that I completely agree with per se as like an independent form of journalism. I think if citizen journalists work with media houses, then it kind of works. But yeah, I'm not sure that they work as a standalone. So that's what I would like to see. And I think that's something that should honestly even start at like the school level so that people know, because by college it's too late. At least like if I had just gotten into understanding where I stand on the political spectrum for the first time in college, I think that would be very disorienting. So yeah.
It's a really interesting point, and I guess we do teach in the education system within, like for example, in history, you learn how to look at sources, you learn how to evaluate the author, their motive, kind of why was this written, who is this written for, but never have I think, in my school years, been given a news article from or a discussion of a contemporary topic. And been taught how to, I guess media literacy is what you're trying to get at. So that really makes sense. I
Yeah.
think it's important to equip young people and people generally, I think, with the tools they need to be able to navigate these different types of viewpoints, understand those biases. But do you think there's also an issue of perhaps the plurality and diversity of voices, and um, whether it's within those mainstream media organizations themselves? um, because as you said, the New York Times is going to be posting things which are aligned with their values, but what are their values and how are those defined? And are those institutions then, are they an accurate enough reflection of the society we live in today?
Absolutely not. I But again, I think this is a problem that exists everywhere, and I think so long as there is a effort to change things, then eventually that change will happen. How willing, the people in these positions of authority are to that change is a whole other question. But, if you take, for example, when I think about how many Muslim people there are who work in my office, I'm not talking about the organization as a whole. I think I can think of two or three that I know off the top of my head, right? And that's absolutely not an accurate, representation of the Muslim population. If I think about people from scheduled caste, scheduled tribe communities, I can't think of anyone. So there's that kind of, having diversity in newsrooms is, I think, the most important goal. I think that's something that all newsrooms need to be working towards, because unless you have these diverse voices, you're just not going to know that these stories exist. And It's not something that'll happen overnight, but I think so long as an organization is working towards that, it's okay. But again, like, it's easier said than done. It's I'm not, I don't know if I'd go up to this CEO of my company and be like, hire, there's a lot of like power politics that are at play, and yeah, it's definitely difficult. And I think maybe this is where grassroots movements do come up. There's a very famous news organization that is, everyone who works there is Dalit, and
Mhm.
that's like a really, really just great way for these stories to be told, and for people from who have these experiences come together and tell their stories and make their voice heard in a environment that otherwise doesn't like even know that these stories exist. Whether that'll make it to the mainstream is a different thing, but that's yeah. I know in like Western media it's dominated by white men, but I think now that I really do think now there is a little bit of a push towards changing that, or at least there's an acknowledgement that this is a problem, which is the bar is so low, but like we have worked towards something, and that's something that I've seen change in the U.S. Definitely, after the Black Lives Matter movement, I saw a lot of, if not change, at least talk and acknowledgement that things need to change. So yeah,
Right. And I think people often fail to realize the true consequences of this, right? Especially in a field like journalism, because essentially what you're doing, when you study politics and political science, you understand how policy making is conducted. One of the first kind of steps of that is framing the narrative and framing the art of what is possible. Right? It's the solutions. Like for example, I remember our professor was using this example of socialized healthcare. Right? In the UK, that is fundamentally part of the political debate in terms of that is one of the choices we could have as a system. Whereas in the US, I guess especially 10 years ago, it's just not an option which should even be discussed. It's not part of the discourse
mm,
because it has already been so delegitimized, and it is not part of it's not framed as a part of the discussion. So what you're doing when you're excluding certain voices from journalism is not just being able to tell stories; it's being able to frame the narrative of the possible universe of solutions or topics or norms and ideas that kind of are part of the decision making system in the democratic system. That has far and wide reaching consequences for, I think, the distribution of power within society, the protection of minority rights, and generally policies and decisions which affect everyone's lives.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, honestly, like, how many stories do you hear from the perspective of someone who is Muslim about what they're experiencing? When the current government does something that could harm them. Rarely, honestly, even like in like among media outlets that are openly left leaning, I think it's very it can get preachy almost, and I think sometimes you just need to let these people speak, the people who are impacted speak, rather than preaching for them. I think that's like another kind of issue that comes up when minority related topics are covered by more left wing media. But you're right, absolutely. I mean, people at the end of the day are only going to care about the issues that they know about. Politicians are only going to care about the issues that the people know about and care about. So if no one's telling these stories, then no one cares about it, right? So it's a cycle.
Yeah, yeah. And how have you found the experience of kind of journalism in India from, I guess, a perspective of covering topics which maybe in a very politically charged environment where there is, I mean, India has moved down the kind of freedom index, press freedom index repeatedly.
Mm.
There are, a couple of years ago, we had a spate of shootings of journalists in Karnataka and other places, and generally quite a charged political environment. How have you found that experience of operating within that environment, dealing with those challenging topics? How have you felt?
It's definitely something that is at the back of my mind constantly. I do think I enjoy some freedom because I'm not focused in on just politics, and like I am putting out a range of stories. So I feel like that, you know, takes the target off my back a little bit. I'm also definitely extremely lucky to be working under someone who is supportive, would like fight for me, and also for an organization that is still, trusted by a lot of people. And it's definitely changed. There are a lot of people who have come up to me and said, do you guys actually print the truth? Is this actually what's happening? Do you like face any pressure from your higher ups to print things that are, against the government or whatever? And I'm like, I literally work for the data team. I am not writing articles about politics. Like, I am not reporting, going out on the field and doing that. So this is not something I can even comment on. This is not my work. But everything that I do, everything that I have seen, everything that I have read and like understood from all of the reporters around me and the editors around me is that yes, we print the truth as it comes in. No one is forcing anyone to say anything otherwise. But if you read our editorials, you have an understanding of where the paper generally sits, right? So that's what I mean when it comes to like media literacy and all of that. But yeah, I also think because I work with the data team, it's hard. Like, I'm like, the government can't come after me for numbers that they've published. So that definitely helps. Yeah, I think honestly, a lot of it is like the security that I get from just like the reassurances from my colleagues and my editors, because what we're printing is the truth, and that's it. At the end of the day, they know it, we know it, and there's no point in being afraid because what's the alternative? Print lies. So
Okay, that's interesting. Um, on that topic, I think that this, I feel to an extent there's a lot of effort these days to make it seem like, like you said, when you're printing the truth or you're being told to print lies. But I feel like there's a concerted almost effort to blur those lines and say no, it's almost that there is no such thing as a lie or a truth, and it's everything's always muddy and everything's always grey, and there is never a black and white, and there is always bias and almost a defeatist attitude towards integrity and truth as an external thing. Do you do you feel that, or do you think no? Generally, it's 99% of the time, or the majority of the time, in a journalistic position, you kind of know what's wrong and what's right.
yeah, I think you can tell what's wrong and what's right. And I wouldn't even actually use the words wrong and right. It's just, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are people telling you? How are people reacting? You can't fabricate that, right? Like, I don't even like like my brain can't even like understand how you would put a spin on these things, because your job as a reporter is to go out, see what's happening, speak to people, and write that down. Of course, you should be putting both sides of, a story together, and you should be representing like all the views that you can and all of that. But I mean, this is like a bit of a cliche, but there's that line where it's like the job of a reporter isn't to quote one person who's saying it's raining and quote another person who's saying it's not raining and put both of that in the article. Your job is to look outside and see if it's raining and see, and then use, pick the quote that you want to use. So you know what's the truth, you know what's actually happening. And yeah, and if the organization you're working for wants to adjust the way that a certain event can be interpreted, you'll know. Like, I've worked on very, very, irrelevant articles that are like page fillers where,
Mm.
my editor really wanted it to go in a certain direction. And I was like, all right, great, cool. But then after speaking to my sources, I was like, there's no way I can write this piece to go in the direction that, my editor maybe wanted. And this was a absolutely not political, it was like a soft news piece. But
Mhm.
still, I was like, these are quotes. Like, I can't change the quotes. This is what the story is going to have to be. So you have to adjust. I explained that to her, and she was like, all right,
Mm.
it is what it is. Maybe doesn't fit what you thought the story would be, but you change what you expect. You don't change the story.
That takes courage to, I guess, depending on what it is and what situation you're in. Obviously, that can mean very different things.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, do you? Okay, that's interesting. What would you say is one thing about working in journalism that turned out to be quite different to how you imagined?
Oh my gosh. I think every workplace is very different. I'm not sure that there was anything about the job itself that surprised me. I think that's also because I had like a base level knowledge of how newsrooms operate. And of course, like through internships and stuff, I did have that exposure. But I think it's more about like how different teams operate, how you work with different kinds of people, how you prepare for different kinds of things. That was a little bit more of like a learning experience for me. Um, and this can be like anything from, met I did like a lot of guest coordination when I was in the US, and that meant meeting and chatting with a lot of senators and congressmen and activists and people whose views I maybe didn't agree with, but now here I am in the green room having a conversation with them about, their kid. So kind of like figuring out how to deal with those situations. I remember in college I did a story about this was during, Brett Kavanaugh was going to be appointed as a Supreme Court judge, and there were a lot of protests that were happening in DC because he had allegedly assaulted a woman when he was in high school. Yes, so there were a lot of protests going on. So I went down to cover it for class, and I remember I just like had to like take a second because it was so information overload. There were so many different things happening, and I had to kind of like make sure I was okay because you don't always hear things that you maybe align with, and that can be hard. So yeah, that was kind of like, something that was challenging for me and not particularly unexpected, but just something that was like a learning experience. Or let me think of something in my current job. When I did a journalism course in India before I started working here, and part of that course we had like a module called covering deprivation, which meant we had to like go out to rural India and, do any story that we wanted, and understanding like the way that the people there speak, what they're comfortable with, not comfortable with. um, I did a video story, so understanding what they were okay with me shooting and what they weren't okay with me shooting, going into their house and making sure that I didn't do anything to make them uncomfortable was something, while also, getting this information out of them that I needed. That was figuring out those nuances, those intricacies was something that I knew I had to do, but you don't really know how to do it until you're doing it.
That makes sense. Yeah. So a lot of different skills, I guess, needed as part of the job. But it sounds like a quite a kind of diverse and rewarding, if challenging career path.
Absolutely.
Would you have any tips for up and coming journalists, people who are interested in the field? Yeah, any tips at all?
Any tips? I think it's really, really important to not put yourself in a box. I never in a million years, I hate math. I hate numbers. Like, never in a million years would I think that I'd be working with data of all the things. Like, I wanted to be a reporter for the longest time. I wanted to be an international correspondent, which I still kind of do, but I was so dead set on that goal.
Hmm.
And I don't think I, blocked myself off from like other opportunities, but I think just being open to the fact that there are so many different topics that you can cover. There's so many different roles you can play. You can now with like multimedia, social media, there's so many different things that you can do. So just figure out a way to experience as much as you can um, before deciding on what it is that you absolutely want to do, because maybe the reason you absolutely want to do that is because you don't know what else to do, right? I
Hmm.
like completely found like a love for covering climate change and environment related stories, and that wasn't even something that was on my radar 2 years ago.
Hmm.
So that's a big tip. I think also I think this goes for all careers, but networking is like probably the reason I have a career now.
Hmm.
um, you just never know who you're going to meet. And this goes something that, someone in DC told me. She was a reporter and she was just giving me some advice. And she's like, when you're sitting in the green room and there's all these guests coming in for their, segments on air, just talk to them, like listen to what they're saying, build like a relationship with them, because you never know, you might need them as a source moving forward. So it goes beyond just, networking with people to get a job. It's
Hmm.
also networking with people who could give you a story or who you could speak to and get perspective. And that's really, really important. Building that network of sources is something you don't have to be an established journalist to do that. You can start from the get go. Um, and also, I think making sure you're happy in your workplace. Um, my work environment right now is very, very, very different from what it was in the US. I think part of that is maybe because it's primarily print now, and print is a little slower. We don't need to run to break news and get it up immediately. And of course, you do need to do that with TV, and that comes with its own stresses. But making sure that you're in an environment where you are happy and excited to do work is so important, because this job will have you working weird hours, working weekends, missing out on, birthdays and dinners and parties and whatever the case might be. So if you're not happy doing the work that you're doing, it's going to take a toll. So, yeah, making sure you're in a place that you feel comfortable, you feel supported, and that might not come immediately, but just knowing that that's something that you want, I think is.
Sounds like really, really powerful advice. And
I'm like talking as though I have like decades of experience and I'm like this old, like wise person.
We are on our way there. I guess I've just realized I've been working for almost half a decade now. But I would say a lot of those, I think, pieces of advice do transfer over to other careers as well, for sure.
Mhm.
Um, one other question I've been meaning to ask you is, of all of these newsroom guests and VIPs that you've, or just people in general, I guess, that you've worked with in your time in journalism, can you think of an example of anyone who really stands out, who is maybe inspiring?
Absolutely. um, oh gosh. Okay. I really had the privilege of working at a really great place in the US, but I remember when I met Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, I was so starstruck. And she was so sweet. It was just really, really so great. Who else?
What did you talk to her about? Was it kind of making small talk whilst they're getting ready, or is it?
I spoke to her boyfriend way more than I spoke to her. And I was like, I don't really want to talk to you. I want to talk to your girlfriend. But yeah, that was a big one. Oh my gosh, who else? I think, oh, I remember, Adam Schiff, who was in charge of Trump's the Trump investigation when he was being impeached, I believe.
Right.
Oh my
Okay.
gosh, that was a very long time ago. But yeah, he was like a big deal at that time. It's funny because if this whole Trump stuff wasn't going on, he'd just be like the other politicians who come in and just sit in the green room. But yeah, it was cool seeing him. Um, I did not. I was going through like my old like pictures, like random screenshots I'd taken. And it's really crazy because I found this screenshot from a booker who's, the producer who gets all these guests to go on air. And she just texted me and she was like, hey, can you send me Zelensky's number real quick? As, because this was during the quid pro quo Trump
Uh-huh.
and Zelensky news cycle. And I was like, it is crazy that I like was just had access to that information.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
pretty cool.
yeah. Um, who else? Honestly,
And
I'm a little bit lame, so I think I was like more fascinated by like the other journalists who came in and also like the journalists who
right,
worked there.
yeah, I've
Yeah,
seen
but
the
then,
spams.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But then we also had like we had like Jane Fonda come in once. What is her name? Oh my gosh, Alyssa Milano, is that her name? I don't know. See, these are celebrities I don't really care about.
Okay, so a long list of people.
Yeah,
Definitely sounds like one of the perks of the job. Getting to speak to lots of interesting people, and yeah, maybe we
yeah,
can tap into your network somewhat for the podcast as well. We'll discuss that later.
yeah.
But
Sounds good.
I will say it's been fantastic having you, and a kind of fantastic conversation as well. Very different, I think. You're our first guest who's not related to the worlds of technology and finance or the venture capital space, which has been a surprisingly kind of strong theme throughout our previous guest. But really, really interesting conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
No, it was great chatting with you. Yeah, I hope I answered your questions and I hope that, people get something out of this.